what movement is next under modernism? The Jazz Age. Now listen.
I'll be the USA in your Chevrolet. The Rocky Quay.
Okay. What did we say? Well, I don't think we said. Oh, what did we say was like sort of the time span for the Lost Generation? It's basically the entirety of modernism. So what are those dates? And what's an easy way to remember those dates? The beginning of World War I and the end of World War II. Just remember, because you can remember that that's the end of World War II by knowing when the 2 atom bombs were dropped. And, of course, by knowing, you're going to know that's not, 1945 isn't the beginning of World War II, because in what year is Pearl Harbor bombed? It's one of the most famous dates in American history. Good. December 7th, 1941. A day that will live in infamy. Yes, so that's how you know it's the end of World War II, that it includes World War II. And know that it includes the 2 world wars because that's part of the devastation, right, of modernism. Devastation, isolation, alienation, stagnation, like this sense of paralysis and existentialism. If life can be extinguished so much, or, you know, we're just going to be outdone by machines anyway, what's the purpose of existence? La la la. All those fabulously depressing things that were expressed so well in what poem? That's like the opening line is the epitome of modernism. The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. What is that line that you need to know? That if I ask you, which of these lines epitomizes, in other words, is a perfect example, like encompasses, like represents, which one of these lines epitomizes modernism, what line are you going to look for? Beautiful. Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread against the sky, like a patient etherized upon a table, numb, unfeeling, unmoving, unmoved, you know, la la la. Okay. And we said that the Lost Generation feels the same way. Basically the same characteristics, same attitudes, with the addition of what distinction for the Lost Generation?
Fear of mass conformity.
Well, that's a part of modernism too. That's one of the characteristics
They were expatriates.
that they share. Yes, expatriation. So all Lost Generation writers they're distinguished. When you say a Lost Generation writer, it is somebody who became so disillusioned with politics and the social life in the United States that at some point they lived in Europe. You know, when I talk about social issues, I'm, you know, mainly the big one that's going to disturb writers so much is segregation. Okay. So the Jazz Age is different in that it's a very distinct time period. It is the 1920s. The 1920s is characterized by the 1920s. And it has to be the 1920s because there's still that underlying sense of, you know, everything has changed. Like there's still this underlying sense of an existential crisis or question, that overwhelming question, you know, like they call it in the Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. But in the 1920s, what happens in the United States?
Industrialization.
Well, industrialization has been happening since the turn of the century, right? Women have the right to vote right before the 1920s. I think it is 1920. It's the 19th Amendment. What is the 18th Amendment? Prohibition. So here's the thing. There's still the devastation of all these characteristics. There's still this mood of modernism. However, there hasn't happened yet the stock market crash of 1929 that will set off the Great Depression, which will be the real killer for everybody. And I mean, where it's not just like, oh, these, social and political and philosophical questions are bothering me. It'll be like, oh, we don't have a job or food or anywhere to live, the real, like where it's like, everybody is affected. It's not just, artists saying, hey, this is no way for a society to live. So it's before that, but still with the First World War and the start of modernism. So there's room for this. There's space for this sense of sort of a cavalier attitude toward that existentialism for the 1920s. And by cavalier, I mean, if the whole world's going to hell in a handbasket, then I'm going to have a good time. It sort of reminds me of the turn of the 21st century. There were all these people, it was like Y2K, all the computers are going to crash, and it's going to be Armageddon, apocalypse, start stockpiling spam, and we're going to have to move to the woods. Like, there were people who were terrified, and then there was another segment of the population that was like, if the world's going to go to hell in a handbasket, then I'm going to party like it's what? 1999. That's correct, Kevin. No wonder you made Dean's List. Okay, so good morning. So that's sort of the attitude of the Jazz Age. And that is, I would say almost bolstered. You would think limited, but it's almost bolstered by Prohibition. Everybody knows what Prohibition is, right? Somebody thinks it's going to be a good idea to make alcohol illegal. Now, when something is made illegal, then everybody stops doing that, and, society puts it down, and it basically gets eliminated from that society, right? Absolutely not. What you do is create, a black market for this item, an unregulated market for that item, a market that will bolster organized crime and corrupt law enforcement during the 1920s, and of course corrupt politicians. And you guys, you've seen the shows, right? Boardwalk Empire, The Untouchables, the movies. The first Godfather starts around the 1920s. It's a very popular period for people. The Great Gatsby, which is what we're going to talk about. It's a very popular period to characterize because it is so distinct and unique. And it really is, I would say, the last debaucherous decade of American history, because you're talking about like the first 10 years of the automobile. Like, there's not a whole lot of there's not roads. Thank you to an African American for inventing the traffic signal. There's not a lot of laws regarding vehicles just yet. Can you imagine? Like, what sort of wild, wild west that was with the vehicles? I mean, okay. All right, so what novel epitomizes this outrageous decade in American history called the Jazz Age? What novel? You did an author map on it. I just mentioned it. The Great Gatsby. It was remade again in 2013. So The Great Gatsby by whom? Who writes? F. Scott Fitzgerald. This is what you need to know as characterizing the mood and attitudes of the Jazz Age. Is everyone familiar with The Great Gatsby? I sort of just assume that everyone is, but it's been in recent years that students haven't read it. And I'm hoping that means that they've seen the movie or whatever. They're stop requiring that in high schools. So if we're talking about this novel that epitomizes the Jazz Age, what does it show?
A lot of partying.
Exactly. A lot of partying. Basically a rollicking good time, bootlegging, rum running, speakeasies, the nightclub. This is the decade that creates the nightclub, But at the end of The Great Gatsby, the party's over, right? And it's almost like, yes, we're just, if the world's going to hell in a handbasket, then I'm going to have a good time. But there's still always that underlying, really overshadowing mood of modernism with all the characteristics that we talked about with modernism in the Lost Generation as well. So that's the Jazz Age. The Great Gatsby is written and published right smack in the middle of the Jazz Age, 1925. So that's what you need to know for the Jazz Age. Nice little 10-year, but very distinctive, very American blip in American history. And of course, The Great Gatsby isn't the only novel, but it is the one that, if you're going to point to one that's like, what novel best represents the Jazz Age, it's Gatsby. So, our last movement that happens or starts during modernism and really carries on a legacy, I would say it's the only literary movement that we talk about where you can turn on the television and see the effects of it today, is the Harlem Renaissance. Now, the Harlem Renaissance starts around the teens. Some scholars have begun putting it there instead of the 1920s because there were two black activist newspapers that had started to be published, magazines in Harlem. And I agree with that. The movement was definitely underway as segregation had already been in place for about 20 years to that point. So the idea of the Harlem Renaissance is this, and let me make sure that nobody's trying to get to me. Okay, no. Hey, what's up, Daryl? Hey, dang, I got people actually watching me today. That's weird. All right, so with the Harlem Renaissance, segregation has happened, and let me ask you this question with regard to realizing the power and force of the Harlem Renaissance. Why do Cubans come to Miami? Why don't they just go to Jacksonville or Mobile, Alabama? Geographically, it's closest. And Soimi, you hit it right on the head as far as this correlation to the Harlem Renaissance. It's where all the Cubans are. Now listen to me in this comparison. Remember we talked about the Great Migration, right? Violence in the South has escalated to, racial violence in the South has escalated to terroristic proportions. And so African Americans leave the South by the hundreds of thousands. And where do they go? To big cities. And why? Well, industrialization in the city has brought jobs, and because of segregation, here's this irony, because of segregation, there has built up, for the very first time in American history, these communities, like cities for Black people. So it's like our own, their own businesses, their own, a sense of unity and community for the very first time. Because prior to segregation, it was illegal for African Americans to gather in large numbers. And you can imagine why for that, right? So that's the Harlem Renaissance, where you have finally a sense of community for African Americans, ironically, in these segregated areas. Because it's like when you have a fence works two ways, right? It might keep people in, yeah, but it also, a fence works two ways, not one. So, what happened was a cultural explosion of all of the arts emanating from these segregated African American urban communities like Harlem. And not just literature, journalism, performance, like dance, singing, the visual arts, sculpture, every single aspect of culture just it explodes out of these communities. And it's unique, and it's American, and it affects popular culture. Well, I say popular culture, American culture in general for the next forever. Like, you can still see its influence today. So very, very powerful. The poetic voice, and listen, these two artists that I speak about for the Harlem Renaissance is scratching the surface for the Harlem Renaissance writers and performers. If you go on YouTube and look up the Harlem Renaissance or big band or swing, you'll find performers that came out of this era. Cab Calloway, Josephine Baker, amazing stuff, and some of whom, like Richard Wright, we lost to Europe because of their disillusionment with segregation, and life here in these United States. So, Langston Hughes, I asked you to find a song that matches the rhythm of this poem. And the reason I do that is because I want you to see the diversity of rhythm within the poem. And can I just say, Stephanie, are you the one who did that jazz version of theme? It's fantastic. It's like you found it. I know if you were looking for a rhythm, like your syllables could be off and whatever, it's in there. There is a flow in there where it all goes together, and you found it. And you found it in a different way, too. It's beautiful, Stephanie. Thank you. I will be reposting that. Y'all be on the lookout for Mop Hughes from one of my class members now, who it's fire. All right. So for theme for English B, you noticed all this diversity of rhythm. That's called something. And the thing that it's called is invented by Langston Hughes. It's called jazz poetry. Okay, so let me write some stuff on the board for you. jazz poetry. And this is what is jazz poetry? It is it's poetry. Well, let me write this down for you guys. So, jazz poetry is poetry in which the rhythms emulate that improvisational rhythm, the improvisational rhythms of jazz. Because you don't see like a jazz band with sheet music. It's improvisational. It's creative. It's spontaneous. You know, that's jazz poetry too. Like, even though, of course, we have a final version of Theme for English B, it's like every time you read it, it sounds spontaneous. Like someone just wrote it, you know, and those rhythms emulate those improvisational rhythms of jazz. And you can look at specific places in the poem and see, like, you know, very powerful examples of jazz poetry. For example, check out, I'm looking at Theme for English B on page 1043. I'm looking at the second stanza. By the way, does this poem have an epigraph? It looks like it, but no. But it does look like it, and that's why I ask you guys. That's why I clarify. What line starts the poem? The instructor said. Because what looks like an epigraph is what the instructor said, that homework assignment. So, but it's not actually an epigraph because it is included within that first line, the instructor said. Even though it does sort of act like an epigraph in that it creates a purpose for the poem, even though it's not the sole purpose. And the mood and tone of the poem, though, is a mood and tone all its own. You could call this homework assignment a catalyst for that, but definitely not a characterization of that. Okay, so let's go home and write a page tonight, and let that page come out of you, and then it will be true. What? What would you? What would your response be like to a teacher who said to do that? It's like, you know, I can just hear the questions. Like, I'm confused. Like, what do you want to get? You know, let that page come out of you. You used to be able to get away with that in English. You can't get away with that anymore. Let that page come out of you. So, all right. Langston Hughes says, let me let this page come out of me. All right, and then I wanted to show you guys the example of that, of a jazz rhythm. I'm looking at the second stanza, and actually it's more like the third stanza. It's not easy to know what is true for you or me at 22 my age, but I guess I'm what I feel and see and hear. Harlem, I hear you, hear me, we too, you, me. Talk on this page, I hear New York too, me who? Do you hear it? Like this, it almost sounds like a spontaneous improvisational rhythm, you know? And it's like, okay, so why is Langston Hughes creating that rhythm for my ear as I read this poem? Well, it says, I hear New York too. What would he have heard? Leaning out of his window? Most likely jazz music, among the thriving and vibrant culture in which he was surrounded, despite the challenges it faced. So you could say, that this is like creating a jazz rhythm. That when you read the poem out loud, you hear what he would have heard in New York. 75 years later, he creates that jazz rhythm for you that he would have been hearing outside of his window when you vocalized this poem. Okay. Langston Hughes invents this, right? Jazz poetry. Do you get it? Yes. Okay. Good. Hi, Harold. You okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
You're okay. All right. Now, I want to talk about imagery in this poem because to so many students, it's like, this poem is such a, powerful rant. This is not, this is not a simple rant. Number one, to have free verse that projects as jazz poetry is infinitely difficult to master, and it's done. I mean, this is what it looks like. This is the example right here. But the poem is also chock full of highbrow poetic devices. There is a zeugma. Don't worry about that one. I'm just telling you what's in it. There's something of a chiasmus. Some fancy literary device stuff. But let me point you to one of the more basic ones so that I'm not teaching you crazy advanced literary device stuff. Look at let's start at line 21, actually, where I left off. Well, I like to eat, sleep, drink, and be in love. Actually, that's the zeugma. A zeugma is when you have a list of things and one thing stands out from the others for emphasis or whatever reason. And that's eat, sleep, drink, and be in love. That's a zeugma. I like to work, read, learn, and understand life. I like a pipe for a Christmas present, or records. Bessie, Bop, or Bach. Now, if you were eating this poem, you definitely would have wanted to write this down in other patterns. Bessie, Bop, or Bach. I see something going on here, Ms. White. I'm not quite sure what it's called, but I know that there's a pattern here. I know that this is something in poetry, and you would be correct. This is called alliteration. Alliteration. Alliteration, and again, this is one of the more common devices, is the repetition it's the consecutive repetition of the primary word sound. And obviously not including that conjunction there. Bessie, Bop, and Bach. What is our consecutive primary repeated sound? Bessie, Bop, Bach. Now, how does this alliteration function? Just a cute way to make things sound interesting? Well, yes, and Bessie, Bop, and Bach are three very different genres of music, right? Bessie is the blues, bop is this precursor to rock and roll, And Bach is this, classical composer. So 3 very different genres of music unified, however, under this device of alliteration. So it's like Langston Hughes unifies these 3 different genres of music, just like he would like to unify the citizens of the United States, right? Beyond the travesty of segregation. Okay, the injustice of segregation. Now, there's 2 more lines I want to point you to. The next line after Bessie Bopper Bach says, I guess being colored doesn't make me not like the same things other folks like who are other races. What do you have to say about these 2 lines? Like sound-wise, poetry-wise. Do these 2 lines flow? No. People trip over them every time. Listen, we went from that very languid flow of, me, who, you, New York, it's very beautiful jazz flow rhythm into this awkward, grammatically incorrect sentence. And it's like a full sentence, right? And it's smack in the middle of the poem, too. Now, we know that Langston Hughes is perfectly capable of the languid flow. So why is there this awkward 2 lines in the poem that's grammatically incorrect? Like, why would he do that? Why is it grammatically incorrect? What's wrong with it? The sentence I just read. What's grammatically wrong with it? It's a double negative. I guess being colored doesn't make me not. Like in Spanish, that's emphatic. Like you can do that. In English, you don't do that. It actually changes the meaning if you do that in English. If you don't not, that means you do. Instead of not, it means yes. So that's why you don't do that in English. So why this grammatical error? Why this awkward sentence? What do you think's going on here? Is it Melissa? Did you say something before about what the sentence does or why?
It's changing the subject. To talk about race.
Well, I think the whole poem talks about race, but you're right. There's definitely a different take on things after this, right? It takes a different turn. You're right. So there is that sense of this sort of segue into like a message, like, the real power punch at the end of this poem. You're right. And there's also a sense of, we said this poem this sentence is awkward. Do you think segregation is awkward? Yeah. Is it a double negative? Yes. It's Langston Hughes' way of saying, hey, this isn't just bad for me, it's bad for you too. It's not just a fence that goes 2 ways, it's an electric fence that goes 2 ways. So to me, that's how metaphorically these language structures function in this line. You know, it's anomalous in Hughes's form. So we know that he's up to something because of that, because it's an anomaly. It stands out. So it's him saying, you know what, segregation, I guess being not, I can never remember this line. It's so awkward. He's saying segregation is awkward and it's a double negative. So do you see where form follows function here? That the very form of these lines communicate a function. You got it? Communicate a message. That's how deep this poem is. It's not just a simple rant. Okay. Then, now, that question. So will my page be colored that I write? That line is where some scholars mark the beginning. Like this line, this line is what marks the moods, the questions, the subjects, the topics for modern African American literature. So will my page be colored that I write? Because what questions does this line invoke? Am I going to be judged by, are you only going to see my blackness in what I've written? What else? What other questions? What other subjects? And there's a million of them as far as modern African American literature. It's like, what is it? Do I have to be black to write it? Do I have to, does it have to be about black people, the black community? Like, these are the questions that encompass modern African American literature. That's right in this. It seems like such a simple line, but it says so much. So will my page be colored that I write? What color is paper?
White. Like anything they touch become colored.
Well,
Who's judge?
Well, I mean, that's the question. That's one of these and it's not not in reality, but by the judgment and measure of that action, by white people. So, will my page be colored? So, what color is ink? Do you see the image? He says, will my page be colored that I write? That page.
You won't see what you write.
That white page needs that black ink. Or else there is there is nothing. And do you see, it's another question that Langston, not a question, but a statement that Hughes brings up to say, you need me. You need me to be white. Without me, you're not white. Do you see it? So will my page be colored that I write? So, if I ask you what line do some scholars mark as the beginning of modern African American literature, that's the line you want to point to. Hey, don't confuse it with proofrock. All right? Know the difference and the importance, the significance of those two lines. Now, let's talk about imagery in this poem. And I know it might not jump out, like Ginsberg and his fruits do. But I'm just going to go ahead and give it to you, and then you find it in there. The imagery, a theme of imagery that you can find within this poem is movement. Okay? In its very structure, we already talked about one kind of movement, and that is musical. You know how there's movements in music? So there you go with the jazz rhythms. So it's musical in movement. Is it geographical in movement? Yes, very much so. In that first stanza, he talks about being born in Winston-Salem, then going to Durham, and then so he goes from south to north, emulating, modeling the Great Migration, marking that, commemorating that in the lines of this poem. And he also shows how he has to travel around the city, right? He can't just go around the block to go to or he can't just go up to his dorm room, can he? You got to travel a long way to get back to where he has to stay. And then, is there a literary movement in this poem? Why, yes, in the very line that I just pointed out to you. So will my page be colored that I write? There's a reflection of a literary movement. And then finally, is there a socio-political movement, a social movement? Yeah, it's very much ahead of its time in a voice about, it's, you know, listen, it's not so much ahead of its time in, you know, of course there are other writers way before this that say segregation is wrong, racism is wrong, obviously, right? But Langston Hughes has a vision of what it is to be American. He recognizes, and this is what makes him progressive and a visionary, he recognizes how this experience is uniquely American. In fact, he says at the end of this poem, what? What does he say close to the end of the poem? Exactly. So it's like, you are white, yet a part of me as I am a part of you. That's American. He recognizes this experience as something distinctly American and a positive, distinctly American aspect. That's progressive for its moment. Now, because 1949, wow. Okay, so is there an industrial movement in this poem? There's an elevator in it, but does that signal? Does it symbolize it? No. So if I gave you a bunch of choices instead, all of these kinds of movements are symbolized or reflected in Langston Hughes' poem through this theme of imagery of movement. You know, so you've got literary, social, geographic, musical, industrial, not so much. No. And there's some other things that I could throw in there. So know how that sense of movement is reflected in the poem. All right. What else here? I think that's it for this one. Theme for English B. Fabulous. All right, so let's move on to Richard Wright. Richard Wright is famous for, and don't forget, Langston Hughes is famous for what? Jazz poetry. Inventing jazz poetry. Creator of jazz poetry. When you get to a famous for Langston Hughes, jazz poetry. Okay, so let's talk about Richard Wright. Now, for me, and this is editorial. This is not a fact you're going to read in a textbook anywhere. But to me, Langston Hughes and Richard Wright are like the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the Malcolm X of Harlem Renaissance literature. Because while Langston Hughes is like, lift up, bring together, positivity, pacifism, let's work this out, we're a part of each other. Richard Wright is like, by any means necessary, will you understand my experience? His work can be, hi Ricardo, his work can be graphically violent, and it's not gratuitous at all. In fact, I think he's probably restrained in the violence that he shows, considering the statistics for lynching of that moment. So, when you think about that, this blows your mind, right? All right. The point of view of this story is what? The man who's almost a man. What's the point of view? Richard Wright. And listen, he's famous for two things that you need to know. And I'm going to tell you what he's famous for in literature in general, and then what he's famous for as a writer. In American history in general, he is famous for being the very first best-selling African-American author. Who is the very first best-selling African-American author? Richard Wright. You also need to know, because it's pretty important, you need to know the novel that garners him that title. It is called Native Son. So, famous for being the first best-selling African-American author in the U.S. U.S. is important because obviously African-American writers had success in Europe before that. And the novel is called Native Son. Then, what he's known for, at least what he's known for as a writer, is the confluence of first and third person narrative to evoke reader empathy. And let me explain what that means. Because I know I just said that, you're like, writing it down like, I don't know what this means. The confluence of first and third person point. The confluence of first and third person point of view to evoke reader empathy. Who makes who is Richard Wright's readership? Who makes him a best-selling author? A predominantly white audience, right? Because the literacy rates, obviously, with segregation and everything else, it was hardly separate but equal. Literacy rates among African Americans would have been low. So, if you're saying, if we've got like a white readership that's making Richard Wright this best-selling author, now wait a minute, all of his work is about a young, uneducated black male from a rural area and all the challenges of his life. How in the world, how does he get a majority white readership to empathize, to have sympathy for that character, or to relate to that character? How do you do that? And look at Dave. You know, is Dave going to be easy for the everyday white man to relate to? No. In fact, he might hate him. Right? He's a criminal. He deserves it, right? Am I right? So, it's through this confluence of first and third person narrative that Richard Wright conjures that magic. What do I mean by the confluence of first and third person narrative? Look at the first paragraph. And while you guys do that, I'm going to end this one and start another one, because I feel like I've been talking forever.